Alright, everybody. So, we're back finally. I apologize for the huge delay, but I started another job to kind of make ends meet while the business is a little slow right now. Working for the post office now, so that's pretty cool. But it's time to start doing a little more videos. I have all the parts I need for my logic analyzer, and I've already started some recordings. I'm working on that still and doing a little more research into the analyzer that I got so I can give you a better understanding. So we're going to do a quick video and I'm going to show you how to solder. You know, it's a pretty basic little thing. A lot of people can do it. Some people just don't grasp the concept, but I honestly feel like anybody can really do it with enough practice. So I'm going to show you the bare basics on how to solder. And the first thing you want to start out with is the stuff you need, alright? Obviously, you're going to need the components that you're going to be using in your soldering project. I'm going to use some just random resistors, okay? So we got some resistors. This is a test board, okay? It's kind of like, you can make a circuit board out of this if you wanted to. It'd be kind of a pain in the butt, but I bought this a while back, and I haven't used it as you can see yet, but I plan on using it to teach my kids how to solder properly, so I'm going to use it to show you guys for the first time around. Another thing you're going to need is angle cutters. Pretty thin, simple little cutters. These are great for cutting off the extra pieces of the legs that stick through the through holes. You're going to need some solder paste. And of course, something to put the solder paste on. I just basically take a Q-tip and cut one of the ends off, and I use that to put the solder paste on the pad. And of course, you're going to need solder. You know, this is just your standard 60-40 solder. It's a 32 thousandths diameter, as you can see right there. It's very basic, but it works great. You're going to need rubbing alcohol and a toothbrush for your rubbing alcohol. This is so when you put your solder paste on and you solder it in, you can clean all your connections up because it's going to leave a residue behind. And of course, last but not least, you're going to need a soldering iron of some kind. This is not the one I'm going to use in this video. I'm using my old school Weller. This is one I got from my old man many years ago. I don't know what model it is. All the stuff wore off over the years. You can see I need to find a new tip somehow for it because it's a little curved, but we don't kink shame here, so we're good. This iron I got not too long ago. It's a temperature adjustable iron, as you can see. Is a very cheap, very basic iron. I'm going to do a review on this. It's not the best iron. I'm going to tell you that right now. But it does the job for very basic things, especially older electronics. The more modern stuff, this thing, even though it says it can get really hot, it doesn't get hot enough in my opinion. But I'll show you that in a whole nother video. But we're going to toss that to the side. What we're going to do now is we're going to get all set up, and I'm going to show you how to put the components, you know, within your through holes on your board. Of course, it's going to be different than this board, but it's still going to be the same from the PCB you're working on, and we'll take it from there, okay? So let's get set up and start this project. Okay, so now we're basically set up here. What's going to happen is we're going to take our component and we're going to bend our legs and then put them through each of these through holes, okay? You can see all those little dots, those are holes. They're going to be similar to the PCB you're working on, except for just not going to have the same kind of spacing like this practice board has. Alright, so first we'll talk about bending the legs. Alright, especially if you're going to put, like, say, a resistor in. This is going to mainly pertain to, like, resistors and diodes, things of that nature. Capacitors and transistors and such. There's very minimal leg bending you're going to have to do, so I won't worry too much about that. But you can either just take your finger and kind of like make a little gap, because you don't want to just bend it against the edge of your resistor or diode or whatever it is you're putting on, because you can cause like a connection issue or damage between the lead and the actual component itself, which is going to cause you problems. But, so create a little gap, put your finger there, and just bend it down nice and straight. There you go. Look at that. You got yourself your bend. The other thing you can do, and of course these aren't required to do this, you can take a pair of needle nose and just at the most narrow part, grab a hold right at the edge of the component and bend it down. And you get yourself a pretty nice pre-measured gap. Okay? So, the next step is to go ahead and put our component through the through hole. So we'll go on this side of the board, and we're going to just pick 2 holes, because again, that's a practice board, and we'll just slide this bad boy into place. Now, of course, this being a practice board, the gaps aren't going to quite be the same, so you might have to make some adjustments if you use a practice board versus like a real PCB. Just kind of depends on what it is you ultimately do. So we got our legs in, as you can kind of see there. Alright, see, there are our legs. Now, at this point, you can either hold the component on the component side of the board and then put a little bit of solder on the tip of your soldering iron and kind of touch each pad to put that solder on there to just hold the component in place, or you can gently just bend your legs over in any direction, as long as you don't make them go flat like this, okay? You don't want to flatten them down. You want to just bend them slightly. This isn't really the most recommended way to do it, because sometimes some components, the easiest way to remove them is to just pull them out while you heat the solder pad and then remove the solder afterwards. And when you got the legs slightly bent like this, it can kind of make that a little bit of a challenge. But it's not that big of a deal, okay? So, we've got our component in place. We got our legs slightly bent, or you put a little bit of dab of solder onto the leg itself to hold it in place. So now I'm going to get you set up and zoomed in and show you how to actually solder this stuff, okay? And before we solder it, I'm going to also add the paste, and I'll show you about that and talk to you about that a little bit. So, let's get set up for the zoom in, alright? Okay, so now that we're zoomed in, you can see a little bit better. What you want to do next is you want to add a little bit of solder paste to each of the holes that you're going to be soldering your legs in, okay? Now, the purpose of the solder paste is a flux. So, what it does is it basically allows and forces, in a way, it's a little bit of both, the solder to go into not only the hole, but onto the leg of the component. So, it's a way to guide your solder into the position that you want it to be in. And you don't need very much. You just need a tiny little bit on there. So what we'll do is we'll just add a little bit of solder paste here. Again, you don't need a whole bunch. You just need a little bit, just enough to kind of get that solder flowing, okay? Yeah, just a little bit more there. Okay. As you can see, I got more than I actually wanted, but it's going to be fine in the big picture of it all. So, at this point, it's time to actually solder. Of course, make sure your soldering iron is heated up. Give it a few minutes to actually completely heat up. Some irons will heat up a lot faster than others. It just kind of depends. But the key thing is, you want to make sure that you have your soldering iron at a 45-degree angle and press the tip up against the pad and a little bit of the lead or the leg of the component that's coming through the through hole. Now, you don't need to put a lot of pressure, and you don't need it to sit on there for too long, especially if you allow your iron to heat up enough. too much heat will lift these copper traces off of the pad, okay? All these copper traces here, if you put too much heat on them, they'll come right off the PCB board, and then you're going to lose your connection. Another thing you want to remember is you don't want to put too much solder in there, especially if you're going to solder the board like we're doing here, where basically the board is laying flat. So what happens is gravity takes over and the solder will go through the hole, and if you're not careful, you get too much solder. Now, when it comes to something like a capacitor or a transistor or a diode or a resistor, it's not as big of a deal. I mean, you still don't want too much coming through, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to things like IC chips, that makes a big deal because it can actually push up on your IC chip and cause shorts or other types of issues within the chip itself. So you want to make sure you only put just enough. Now, like I said, 45-degree angle, you're going to see this solder paste melt, and you're going to add your solder. So we'll come down here, and we're going to start adding our solder. Sometimes you got to get the tip a little wet. Just a little bit, and that's all it takes. See? Now it's perfectly soldered. We'll go to the next one, do the same thing. There we are. We have our joint soldered. Now the next step to the whole soldering and everything is you need to clip off the leads. And that's all this extension piece of the lead coming out. If you don't clip those off, you're going to cause a short. Now, here's the proper way to do it. You want to come to the very top of the solder joint. Alright? And then you're going to clip it. Just like so. Now, that's important because if you come down too close, like right into the solder itself, and then clip it off, I mean, will it work? Sometimes, yeah, it will. But when you do that, you take the risk of actually causing microfractures in the solder itself, because the cutting process could actually cause the solder joint to crack or fracture, which can make a non-perfect connection. Now, it may be connected and working fine for a while, but it's a weak connection that will fail a lot quicker than it should fail. Alright? Let's flip this board over once. And as you can see, solder didn't come all the way through. So that's a good thing. That's what we want. Alright? But the next step is we use flux, or the solder paste. We need to clean this off because it's going to leave a nasty residue. So at this point, you're going to go ahead and take your rubbing alcohol that I showed you and your toothbrush, and you're just going to dab a little bit of that rubbing alcohol on your toothbrush. You don't need very much. It's just a tiny little bit, and you're just going to clean it. Just scrub her down real quick. Just like so, okay? Now, what I like to do, and you don't have to do this, I like to take a piece of paper towel and just dab it dry. Rubbing alcohol will evaporate, and it will evaporate quite quickly. But sometimes you just want it to be done faster, so just dab it. Don't wipe it. If you wipe it, you may get some of the particles from your actual paper towel on here, and it could cause issues. I've had it happen before. Alright, there we go. So, as a quick review, you're going to bend your component legs if needed, put them through the through holes, get some solder paste on there so it allows for an easier flow of the solder. Trim your legs right above the solder joint, okay? So you don't want to cut into the solder, you want to cut above the solder. And then you're going to clean it with some 91% isopropyl alcohol, and that's the bare minimum. The higher percentage, the better. And then dab it clean. And there you go. You have your solder joint. And like I mentioned before, don't keep your soldering iron on there too much. Don't add too much solder. It's just a tiny little bit. And you saw that in the video. I only put a little bit in there. It wasn't very much at all. So you don't need to go too much. Other than that, there's really not much more I can tell you about soldering. Just remember to keep your solder iron at a 45-degree angle, or pretty close to a 45-degree angle. Have the tip on the pad and a little bit onto the leg or the lead, and then start adding your solder. And sometimes you need to add a little solder to the tip of your soldering iron before it starts flowing onto the pad. Besides that, that's pretty much it. I know it was a very short video. I wasn't planning on making this too long. It's just your basics of soldering. That's how you solder, okay? So, go ahead and order one of these boards if you want to actually start practicing. It's pretty cheap. They're like $3 on Mauser. And you can practice all the soldering you want. Otherwise, the only other thing I can tell you to do is get an old PCB board from, I don't know, a stereo or a radio or anything. It doesn't matter. Any board that just doesn't work or is worthless. And just practice. Remove the components and put them back in and solder. And see the differences. Like, you know, if you want to, keep the iron on there for too long and see what happens. And you'll find out quite quickly what happens when the iron's on there too long. Add too much solder, do all that stuff on your practice board just so you can visually see the issues that can come up. Alright guys, that's going to be it for this video. I appreciate you watching. Hope to see you on the next one. I'm hoping the next one's going to be the logic analyzer, but we'll find out. But there you go. That's how you make a solder joint. A proper solder joint that's going to be strong and should last you for a very, very long time. Have a good one, guys, and we'll see you in the next one.